Welcome to Chapter 11, Environmental Justice. In this chapter, we will cover various aspects of how environmental justice plays a role in nearly every facet of our lives, from civil rights, racism, and how countries deal with their own environmental issues. Let's get started. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Environmental justice is a concept that was coined in the early 1960s during the civil rights movement and has increasingly picked up momentum as our social justice movements and environmental issues have grown. Protests in that era helped encourage the development of major environmental laws like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and Endangered Species Act, the main federal laws that are still in place to protect the environment. The issues of racism and socioeconomic justice are central to the issue of environmental justice. At its core, the environmental justice guarantees that all people have equal access to a health, safety, and sustainable environment, as well as protection from environmental harm. Environmental justice assumes and recognizes community care and Indigenous and First Nations knowledge. It acknowledges how privilege, power, and oppression are integral to our understanding of how we are impacted by climate change and our environment. Examples of environmental justice include, but are not limited to, the following: the changing demographics of urban areas, loose permitting requirements, and exclusionary zoning laws have funneled racial and ethnic minorities into areas with a greater degree of environmental degradation and reduced support. When urban areas were developed across the U.S., zones reserved exclusively for residential purposes were often expensive. Meanwhile, mixed-use zones were more affordable but allowed residential and industrial buildings to be built side by side. This led to a higher population density in areas closer to environmental hazards. Residents of environmentally degraded areas do not or cannot move because of lack of financial resources, ownership of current land, and sense of place. Negative environmental factors can compound social and economic conditions and lead to higher levels of chronic health problems such as asthma, diabetes, and hypertension for minorities and low income communities. Availability of cheap land in disadvantaged urban areas has led to gentrification, an increase in property values that often makes the area unaffordable to existing, generally lower income residents. This leads to displacement as well as social, economic, and cultural stress. We witness environmental injustice when our single use plastic is incinerated, causing air pollution in low income communities in the US, or when it is shipped overseas to overwhelm Southeast Asian communities. For 3 decades, the United States and other industrialized nations have shipped most of their plastic waste overseas, primarily to China, where cheap labor and voracious factories dismantled the scrap and turned it into new plastic goods. But China banned nearly all plastic waste imports amid concerns that emissions from processing were harming the environment. Many scrap dealers rerouted their cargo to smaller recyclers in nearby Southeast Asian countries, which were suddenly overwhelmed by tides of foreign refuse. The story of environmental injustice and bad decision making, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, began in 2014 when the city switched its drinking water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River in a cost saving move. Inadequate treatment and testing of the water resulted in a series of major water quality and health issues for Flint residents, issues that were chronically ignored, overlooked, and discounted by government officials even as complaints mounted that the foul smelling, discolored, and often off-tasting water piped into Flint homes for 18 months was causing skin rashes, hair loss, and itchy skin. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission, a state established body, concluded that the poor governmental response to the Flint crisis was the result of systemic racism. The Camp Lejeune water contamination problem occurred at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina from 1953 to 1987. During that time, United States Marine Corps personnel and families at the base bathed in and ingested tap water contaminated with harmful chemicals at all concentrations from 240 to 3,400 times current safe levels. An undetermined number of former residents later developed cancers or other ailments, which could be due to the contaminated drinking water. Victims claim that the United States Marine Corps leaders concealed knowledge of the problem and did not act properly to resolve it or notify former residents. These Marines and their families, including those who were in utero at the time, have suffered severe health consequences including cancers, fertility issues, Parkinson's disease, heart defects, and eye defects. Social justice aims to ensure fair treatment of individuals and groups. The concept of social justice is that every group or individual receives a fair share of social and economic benefits, as well as environmental benefits. As such, environmental justice is an integral part of social justice. In social justice, advantages as well as disadvantages should be distributed evenly across all members of society, regardless of their race or background. Issues that impact the environment have impacts on the people who live there as well. And when some people have access to resources that help them relieve those impacts while others don't, that becomes a social justice issue. The connection between social justice and human rights has strengthened over the years to the point where many use social justice and human rights interchangeably. While they are technically different, it's clear to activists that one can't thrive without the other. When a society is just, it protects and respects everyone's human rights. When a society respects and promotes human rights, social justice flourishes. This connection is essential because human rights are recognized globally. When activists fight for social justice, they can lean on the connection with human rights to hold governments, corporations, and individuals accountable. A just society depends on access to essentials like shelter, food, medical care, and education. It isn't enough for a society to invest in innovations or create new opportunities. Society must also prioritize access. If access is restricted based on factors like gender, race, or class, it leads to suffering for individuals, communities, and a society as a whole. Social justice activists spend a lot of time working to restore and increase access for everyone and not just a few select groups. Who gets to have a say in society? Social justice isn't possible if only a few voices are respected. Unfortunately, the voices of the marginalized and vulnerable are often silenced in favor of those with more wealth, cultural influence, and political power. This is even the case when people have good intentions and want to address major societal problems. If the voices of those most affected aren't heard, solutions are likely to fail or possibly make things worse. Participation must be promoted, encouraged, and rewarded so everyone, especially those who haven't had a chance to participate before, can speak. Many people believe equality is one of the principles of social justice, but is actually equity. What is the difference? Equity takes into account the effects of discrimination and aims for an equal outcome. There's an off-cited and adapted graphic which demonstrates this clearly and simply. Three people are trying to watch a baseball game over a fence. All of them stand on a box. One can easily see the field while the other one can just barely see, and while the last person is still unable to watch. Equality has given everyone just one box to stand on, even though the tallest person doesn't need a box, and one box doesn't allow the shortest person to see. Equity gives the tallest person the tallest person's box to the shortest person, allowing them to see. Now everyone can watch the game. Lead is a metal that occurs naturally in the Earth's crust, but human activities such as mining, burning fossil fuels, and manufacturing has caused it to become more widespread. Lead was also once used in paint and gasoline and is still used in batteries, solder, pipes, pottery, roofing materials, and some cosmetics. For centuries, lead was used in common household products like eating utensils, pipes, and solder, and bullets. Occasionally, users and manufacturers of these goods would develop lead poisoning, but such cases were not common, or at least they were not commonly diagnosed. Lead-based paints for homes, children's toys, and household furniture have been banned in the United States since 1978, but lead-based paint is still on the walls and woodwork in many older homes and apartments. Most lead poisoning in children results from eating chips of deteriorating lead-based paint. When paint breaks down, it can turn into dust in or outside of the home. Plus, some children peel paint and eat it or suck or chew on windowsills. In these situations, extreme lead exposure can occur from direct ingestion. Lead pipes, brass plumbing fixtures, and copper pipes soldered with lead can release lead particles into tap water. Lead solder in food cans, banned in the United States, is still used in some countries. Lead present in automobile exhaust enters the atmosphere where the heavy lead particles can fall near the point of exhaust, or they can be carried some distance from the source. In most cases, higher levels of lead were found near roadways and in or near homes painted with lead. However, since these particles are not visible to the eye, it is impossible to know where contamination is present. Even today, decades after lead was banned in most paints and gasoline, remnants of lead are found in soils and traces of lead paint are found in older homes. Lead poisoning occurs when lead builds up in the body over months or years. Even small amounts of lead can cause serious health problems. Children younger than 6 years are especially vulnerable to lead poisoning, which can severely affect mental and physical development. At very high levels, lead poisoning can be fatal. Lead-based paint and paint contaminated dust in older buildings are common sources of lead poisoning in children. Other sources include contaminated air, water, and soil. Adults who work with batteries, do home renovations, or work in auto repair shops might also be exposed to lead. There is treatment for lead poisoning, but taking some simple precautions can help protect you and your family from lead exposure before the harm is done. Initially, lead poisoning can be hard to detect. Even people who seem healthy can have high blood levels of lead. Signs and symptoms usually don't appear until dangerous amounts have accumulated. Factors that may increase your risk of lead poisoning include age. Infants and young children are more likely to be exposed to lead than are older children. They might chew paint and flakes off the walls and woodwork, and their hands could be contaminated with lead dust. Young children also absorb lead more easily, and it's more harmful for them than it is for adults and older children. Living in an older home. Although the use of lead-based paints has been banned since the 1970s, older homes and buildings often retain remnants of this paint. People renovating an older home are even at higher risk. Certain hobbies, such as making stained glass and some jewelry, require the use of lead solder. Refinishing old furniture might put you in contact with layers of lead paint. And finally, living in developing countries. Developing countries often have less strict rules regarding exposure to lead than do developed countries. American families who adopt a child from another country might want to have the child's blood tested for lead poisoning. Immigrant and refugee children are also should be tested. Based on examining the data from the 1960s to 70s and with the help of computer-aided mapping, it was determined that the majority of the people impacted by lead poisoning were poor children of color living in cities. Since then, Congress has passed a number of laws related to lead. These laws addressed lead in paint, dust, and soil, lead in the air, lead in the water, and disposal of lead waste. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is addressing lead contamination and resulting hazards under these laws in many ways, including issuing and enforcing regulations. The EPA also helps the regulated community understand the federal requirements with policy and guidance documents to assist in complying with the regulations. The United States has made substantial progress in reducing lead exposure, but significant disparities remain along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. Under this strategy, EPA will focus on eliminating the disparities in blood levels by taking specific actions to prevent children being exposed and exposure inequalities that could lead to lifelong health effects and barriers to social and economic well-being. The phrase environmental racism was coined by civil rights leader Dr. Benjamin Chavez. He defined it as the intentional siting of polluting and waste facilities in communities primarily populated by African Americans, Latinas, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, migrant farm workers, and low income workers. Study after study has shown that those communities are disproportionately exposed to fumes, toxic dust, ash, soot, and other pollutants from such hazardous facilities located in their midst. As a result, they face increased risks of health problems like cancer and respiratory issues. Of course, low-income communities of color have long complained of being treated as dumping grounds for environmental polluters. However, it wasn't until 1982, after a rural black community in North Carolina was designated as a disposal site for soil laced with carcinogenic compounds, that those complaints garnered national attention. The incident prompted civil rights leaders to converge on Afton, North Carolina, where they joined residents in marches and demonstrations. The waste site went in anyways and later leached compounds into the community's drinking water, but a spotlight had been turned on the pattern. This is part of what helped launch the environmental justice movement, which was the response by civil rights leaders to combat environmental racism. In 1983, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus who was at the Afton protests went on to request a General Accounting Office study that found 75% of hazardous waste sites in 8 states were placed in low-income communities of color. The subsequent landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, co-authored by Chavez and Charles Lee for the United Church of Christ, revealed this pattern was even more widespread and replicated across the entire country. Eminent sociologist Robert Bullard, known as the father of environmental justice, identified additional examples and helped solidify the growing movement. He also expanded the definition of environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages individual groups or communities based on race. A brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Cleaning up and reinvesting in these properties protects the environment, reduces blight, and takes development pressures off green spaces and working lands. Since its inception in 1995, EPA's Brownfields and Land Revitalization Program has grown into a proven, results-oriented program that has changed the way communities address and manage contaminated property. When brownfields sit idle, everybody loses. Neighbors face environmental worries and reduced property values. Cities see roads, sewers, and other infrastructures underused. New businesses seek out green fields or undeveloped land, encouraging sprawl. And brownfield owners must deal with a long list of worries from potential lawsuits to deriving too little income from their property. When owners or developers clean up brownfields and put them to new use, many people benefit. Cleanups address environmental problems. Redevelopment can bring new jobs and higher tax revenues. Revitalized brownfields can breathe new life into neighborhoods. Brownfields offer opportunities that go beyond their old uses. Developers have transformed brownfields into everything from golf courses and driving ranges to mixed developments with housing, offices, shopping, and open space. Smaller properties have found new life as bakeries and greenhouses. In short, many uses may be open to a clean site. Many communities, businesses, and environmentalists agree that brownfield redevelopment is worth encouraging. As a result, a variety of public and public sector guidance and incentives have been developed to encourage brownfield redevelopment. Redevelopment is seldom easy or risk-free, but if done right, redevelopment can bring special rewards, peace of mind, income, and a cleaner environment. We've talked a lot about the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and they play a huge role in environmental justice. The mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment. The EPA works to ensure that Americans have clean air, land, and water. National efforts to reduce environmental risks are based on the best available scientific information. Federal laws protecting human health and the environment are administered and enforced fairly, effectively, and as Congress intended. Environmental stewardship is integral to U.S. policies concerning natural resources, human health, economic growth, energy, transportation, agriculture, industry, and international trade, and these factors are similarly considered in establishing environmental policy. All parts of society, communities, individuals, businesses, and state, local, and tribal governments have access to accurate information sufficient to effectively participate in managing human health and environmental risks. Contaminated lands and toxic sites are cleaned up by potential responsible parties and revitalized, and finally, chemicals in the marketplace are reviewed for safety. All of this is handled by the EPA. The Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights supports the EPA's mission by providing leadership on EPA's environmental justice and external civil rights priorities. The Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights provides resources and other technical assistance on civil rights and environmental justice, engages with communities with environmental justice concerns, and provides support for the community-led action. This this office also enforces federal civil rights laws, including Title VI, that together prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, including on the basis of limited English proficiency, sex, disability, or age by applicants for and recipients of federal financial assistance from the EPA. Since the creation of the EPA's Environmental Justice Program in 1992, the EPA understood the need to work with both federally recognized tribes and all other indigenous peoples to effectively provide for environmental and public health protection in Indian country and in areas of interest to tribes and other indigenous peoples. In July 2014, the EPA completed its policy on environmental justice for working with federally recognized tribes and indigenous people. The policy describes how EPA works with federally recognized tribes and indigenous people throughout the United States and with others living in Indian country. The 17 principles of the policy help EPA protect the environment and public health and address environmental justice concerns in Indian country. The policy also includes implementation tools available to the agency. The policy focuses on EPA's work with federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes, tribal members, indigenous community based grassroots organizations, Native Hawaiians, individual Native Americans, and others living in Indian country. The policy also discusses EPA's work with other federal agencies, state agencies, and other interested groups. The buildup of global waste through the years is not an enjoyable subject to dwell on. However, given how certain countries and communities around the world bear more of the burden of plastic pollution than others, it is necessary to consider how current global waste production and waste management practices exacerbate inequalities. Recent efforts to curb waste exporting abroad does not change the fact that countries have found ways around these new laws or that the practice has worsened and will keep worsening as long as it continues. Not only this, but the practice of waste exporting shows a lack of leadership on the part of the global north to lead the efforts on climate action. Export waste is the practice that occurs when countries transport their waste that they deem recyclable abroad and is typically transported from developed countries to developing countries. Given that in 2021 plastic production had skyrocketed to a total of 10 billion tons, and that between 1988 and 2021, around 250,000 million tons of said plastic waste was transported abroad, it is clear that the global north has taken full advantage of the practice of exporting waste. However, it is a dangerous practice and outright exploitative of the global south, considering that the countries that waste has been sent to over the years do not have the tools to safely dispose of it. For instance, data from Plastic Pollution Coalition demonstrates that in 2018, the United States shipped over 1 million tons of plastic abroad, and 78% of this waste was shipped to countries that lack safe waste management regulations. Not only does export waste display a lack of accountability on the countries participating in the practice of managing their own waste production, but there's also many harmful effects that accompany waste management. Because of this, waste exporting further exemplifies a lack of care on the part of countries participating in the practice for the health and well-being of both the environment and the people's physical health. To put this into perspective, a lot of foreign plastic sent to Vietnam is processed on the informal scale, which requires many resources and leads to both air and water pollution. Additionally, in Indonesia, farming used to be widespread, though today the land in this area has been adversely transformed by plastic waste exports. Overall, a 2021 report by the Environmental Investigation Agency recorded that the global waste trade harms both environmental health and water quality, triggers air pollution, and contributes to both biodiversity loss and to climate change. As for additional direct harm done to communities, the global waste trade can heighten the impacts brought on by natural disasters and can lead to toxic chemicals being unleashed into communities. It is vital that countries responsible for exporting waste are held accountable for burdening communities with their trash because grave environmental and health problems have been literally and metaphorically dumped on communities, and they should not have to provide their own environmentally sound solutions to dealing with the said waste. The good news is that there have been commendable attempts to curb waste exporting. China, for one, which had previously been accepting a significant amount of waste from foreign countries, banned foreign plastic waste from entering the country in 2018. A few years after this, the Basel Convention, which under the United Nations Environmental Program regulates transboundary movements of hazardous and other wastes, decided to place harsh limitations specifically on plastic waste exports, and these limitations have been in effect since January of 2021. A positive feature of this amendment to the Basel Convention is that the potential to get countries to assume ownership for their own waste production and also produce less waste in the future, which the European Union is currently doing. In this section, we take a look at environmental justice issues taking place in other parts of the world and how they're being handled. Let's get started. Europe has historically been and remains responsible for a disproportionately high share of global environmental destruction and resource consumption. The amount of extraction needed to meet Europe's high resource demand has a heavy toll on the environment and humans alike, which with greater severity in the global south. Europeans use vast amounts of land and water resources from other continents, contributing to soil degradation through the use of pesticides and causing ever increasing emissions through long transportation routes. Environmental injustices therefore take place at both local and global scales. As a response to the rise in global temperatures, the European Union is determined to reach a climate neutral economy by 2050. To set to reach the goal set out by the UN's Green Deal, the European Union needs to play a leadership role in the global and interregional debates on the environment, sustainability, and human rights. While Europe has been at the forefront of creating environmental problems, it has also been at the forefront of finding solutions, even if it falls a long way short of genuine sustainability. Europe has made progress in relation to resource efficiency and the circular economy. Material consumption has remained relatively stable and resource efficiency improved as the gross domestic product has increased. Total European Union water abstraction decreased by 15% between 2000 and 2019. As set in the European Green Deal, Europe is committed to becoming a climate neutral continent by 2050. Faced with the sustainability challenges, achieving sustainability requires complete transformation of key systems, the way Europe produces food, produce and consume goods, move and build their cities while boosting nature's resilience and preparing for the impacts of climate change. Many Asian countries and Pacific islands have lived in harmony with nature and cared for the planet well before sustainability became a trend. However, the mainstream environmental movement often focuses on global north countries and their contributions to climate action. The climate emergency will affect the global community, but the effects will not be distributed equally. Of the top countries at most risks from the negative impacts of climate change, 50% of them are Asian and Pacific Island regions, including Fiji, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Japan, and India. According to a recent study, Southeast Asia will potentially face more severe consequences than the rest of the world, and Pacific Islands are face to face with rising sea levels, erosion of coastal areas, increased droughts, and drastic weather patterns. As the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change and most reliant on the nature to survive, Asian countries and Pacific Islands center environmental justice and focus on systemic change to value people and planet. Their commitments to climate action are deeply rooted in culture and tradition. Many grassroots organizations in these regions have already developed community based solutions to local economies and led climate adaptation strategies that blend tradition and science. Asia holds 20% of the world's biodiversity, 14% of the world's tropical forests, and 34% of global coral resources, and the greatest number of fish and aquaculture in the world. However, poor management of natural resources and corruption have a large destructive impact on the region's ecological systems. Injustice is at the heart of Africa's experience of the climate crisis. Historically, the continent has contributed less than 3% to global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet it is one of the most climate vulnerable regions. Africa is a highly diverse continent with a myriad of different ethnic and cultural identities. It also has extremely variable climates with hot, dry deserts in the north and south and tropical rainforests near the equator. There are numerous examples of environmental justice problems from other parts of the world, some of which we've already discussed. However, one of the biggest is the enormous amounts of e-waste that have been shipped to Africa. E-wastes include cell phones, computers, monitors, etc. The components are burned to remove the plastic and rubber so that they can extract the metal. Unfortunately, burning plastic, rubber, and other parts creates toxic fumes. Lead, cadmium, dioxins, furans, arsenic, phthalates, and other toxic pollutants are a regular part of the air. But now more and more toxins are being found in the water, soil, and therefore food grown in the surrounding regions. South America, home to the second largest river and the world's longest mountain range, exemplifies biological diversity in natural landscapes that breed terrestrial, marine, and aquatic life and creates a diverse environment for living organisms. Climate change and global warming are challenges that place the future resources development and prosperity of citizens of the Americas in jeopardy. But specific hazards such as rising sea levels, warming temperatures, deforestation, and more frequent and extreme weather events, places like the Caribbean are at higher risk to the point of coastal communities and entire islands potentially disappearing if the dangers of global warming are not addressed collectively and urgently today. Latin America and the Caribbean are among the most sensitive regions to climate related disasters on the planet. In March 2018, the region adopted a treaty known as the Ezequiel Agreement, named for the place in Costa Rica where it was signed, which seeks to protect environmental defenders in their right for climate justice and ensure that vulnerable communities in the area have a voice in decisions affecting the environment they live in. While 25 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have signed the agreement, only about half of them have ratified it. The Ezequiel Agreement is a treaty that holds governments responsible for protecting the environment. It will help deliver commitments made under the multilateral environmental agreements that are aimed at addressing climate change, conserving biodiversity, protecting oceans, safeguarding food and water security, preventing pollution, managing waste, and ensuring that sustainable development in the Caribbean delivers benefits in line with the Sustainable Development Goals for people, planet, and prosperity. The Ezequiel Agreement is the first of its kind in the region and the first in the world to lay out specific protections for environmental defenders, and it covers both environmental and human rights. Over the course of the next two slides, we will take a look at the 15 most pressing issues for the environment as of 2023. First, we have global warming from fossil fuels. As of May 2023, carbon dioxide parts per million is at 420, and the global temperature rise is 1.15 degrees Celsius compared to pre industrial levels. The last time carbon dioxide levels on our planet were as high as today was more than 4 million years ago. Increased emissions of greenhouse gases have led to a rapid and steady increase in global temperatures, which in turn is causing catastrophic events all over the world, from Australia and the US experiencing some of the most devastating bushfire seasons ever recorded, locusts swarming across parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, disseminating crops, and a heat wave in Antarctica that saw temperatures rise above 20 degrees Celsius for the first time. Next is poor governance. Economists and environmentalists have urged policymakers for years to increase the price of activities that emit greenhouse gases, one of our biggest environmental problems, the lack of which constitutes the largest market failure, for example, through carbon taxes, which will stimulate innovations in low carbon technologies. Next is food waste. A third of the food intended for human consumption, around 1.3 billion tons, is wasted or lost. This is enough food to feed 3 billion people. Food waste and loss account for a third of greenhouse gas emissions annually. If it was a country, food waste would be the third highest emitter of greenhouse gases behind China and the United States. Next is biodiversity loss. The past 50 years have seen a rapid growth of human consumption, population, global trade, urbanization, resulting in humanity using more of the Earth's resources than it can replenish naturally. A recent report found that the population size of mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, and amphibians have experienced a decline of an average of 68% between 1970 and 2016. The report attributes this biodiversity loss to a variety of factors, but mainly land use change, particularly the conversion of habitats like forests, grasslands, and mangroves into agricultural systems. Animals such as pangolins, sharks, and seahorses are significantly affected by the illegal wildlife trade, and pangolins are critically endangered because of it. Next is plastic pollution. A report by science journal Nature determined that currently roughly 14 million tons of plastic make their way into the oceans every year, harming wildlife habitats and the animals that live in them. The research found that if no action is taken, the plastic crisis will grow to 29 million metric tons per year by 2040. If we include microplastics into this, the cumulative amount of plastic in the ocean would reach 600 million tons by 2040. Next is melting ice caps and sea level rise. The climate crisis is warming the Arctic more than twice as fast as anywhere on the planet. Today, sea levels are rising more than twice as quickly as they did for most of the 20th century as a result of increasing temperatures on Earth. Seas are now rising an average of 3.2 millimeters per year globally, and they will continue to grow up to about zero point 0.7 meters by the end of the century. Next is deforestation. Every hour, forests the size of 300 football fields are cut down. By the year 2030, the planet might have only 10% of its forests. If deforestation isn't stopped, they could all be gone in the next 100 years. Continuing our discussion on the 15 biggest problems as of 2023, next we have air pollution. One of the biggest environmental problems today is outdoor air pollution. Data from the World Health Organization shows that an estimated 4.2 to 7 million people die from air pollution worldwide every year, and that 9 out of 10 people breathe air that contains high levels of pollutants. Ocean acidification. Global temperature rise has not only affected the surface, but is the main cause of ocean acidification. Our oceans absorb about 30% of carbon dioxide that is released into the Earth's atmosphere. At higher concentrations of carbon emissions are released thanks to human activities such as burning fossil fuels, as well as the effects of global climate change, such increased rates of wildfires, so do the amounts of carbon dioxide that is absorbed back into the sea. Agriculture. Studies have shown that the global food system is responsible for up to one-third of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, of which 30% comes from livestock and fisheries. Crop production releases greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide through the use of fertilizers. Agriculture not only covers a vast amount of land, but also consumes a vast amount of fresh water, another of the biggest environmental problems on this list. Food and water insecurity. Globally, more than 68 billion tons of topsoil is eroded every year at a rate of 100 times faster than it can naturally be replenished. Laden with biocides and fertilizer, the soil ends up in waterways where it contaminates drinking water and protected areas downstream. Fast fashion and textile waste. The global demand for fashion and clothing has risen at an unprecedented rate that the fashion industry now accounts for 10% of global carbon emissions, becoming one of the biggest environmental problems of our time. Fashion alone produces more greenhouse gas emissions than both the aviation and shipping sectors combined, nearly 20% of global wastewater, or about around 93 billion cubic meters from dyeing textiles. Overfishing. Over 3 billion people around the world rely on fish as their primary source of protein. About 12% of the world relies upon fisheries in some form or another, with 90% of these being small-scale fishermen. Think of small boat with a crew, not a ship, using small nets or even rods and reels and lures, not too different from the kind you probably use. Of the 18.9 million fishermen in the world, 90% of them fall under the latter category. Cobalt mining. Cobalt is quickly becoming the defining example of the mineral conundrum at the heart of the renewable energy transition. As a key component of battery materials that power electric vehicles, cobalt is facing a sustained surge in demand as decarbonization efforts progress. The world's largest cobalt supplier is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it is estimated that up to a fifth of the production is produced through artisanal miners, many of which are young women and kids. Finally, we have soil degradation. Organic matter is a crucial component of soil as it allows it to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air naturally and effectively through photosynthesis, and part of this carbon is stored in the soil as soil organic carbon. Healthy soil has a minimum of 3 to 6% organic matter. However, almost everywhere in the world, the content is much lower than that.